Good morning, everybody. We're about to start the webinar, just waiting for a few more people to jump online, and we'll see you soon. Good morning. My name is Annette, and I work in the marketing team at FCB Group. I'd like to thank you for taking some time out of your busy day to join our webinar, Tried and Tested Online Performance Review Tips. This webinar is powered by Enable HR and HR Assured. Both brands are part of FCB Group, and together we help businesses navigate around Australia and New Zealand's complex employment laws, mitigate workplace risks, and ensure they're compliant. So thank you everybody for joining. If you're not familiar with us, I'd just quickly like to explain the many benefits when partnering with us. Enable HR is a cloud-based human resources information system, and the software stores and manages all of your employee files securely in the cloud. You can access hundreds of legal documents and templates created by our workplace experts, and the workflows and checklists inside of Enable HR protect your business by stopping you from accidentally doing something illegal when following a sensitive HR process, such as managing a difficult employee. HR Assured is the outsourced service that helps you build a smarter business. HR Assured clients have access to our award-winning services, including our 24/7 telephone advisory service, comprehensive HR audit, WHS, also known as HS audit in New Zealand, HR software, H&S software, insurance and representation, and a library of legal resources. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to Sascha, Nicoll, and Emily Fisher. Sascha is an employment relations and safety consultant at HR Assured New Zealand, and Sascha supports businesses on various workplace matters, including people management, health and safety, procedural development, and HRIS support. Emily is...
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Sascha.
How are you?
Good, I'm good. And Emily is an experienced senior workplace relations consultant at FCB Group, and she handles complex workplace issues. Emily has a special interest in providing clients with comprehensive advice and solutions to ensure they can promote a functioning and compliant workplace. Welcome, Emily.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so today we're going to be covering performance reviews, and Sascha and Emily will be leading the conversation. They'll tell you why they're an essential part of managing your people, and they'll also be sharing their best practice performance review process with you. Just at the end of the session, there will be time to answer some of your questions. So if you do have one, pop it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen there, and we will get to that at the end. You can do it throughout. So if you have a question that pops up in your mind, do it then and there. So let's start first off with some common questions about performance reviews. Emily, I'm going to ask you this one. one of the things that seems to hold managers back from conducting performance reviews is time. The benefits far outweigh the cons. How can performance reviews boost employee experience and engagement?
Thanks, Annette. Well, look, I think the first thing to kind of touch on, if we can just go back to the slide before this one, is just those real kind of common reasons that I think companies tend to avoid those performance reviews. And look, I think there are a number of reasons that kind of managers and companies might decide to avoid them. But the first thing that really comes to mind is the time that you do have to spend, both managers and your staff that are engaging in the performance reviews, to get the entire process done from start to finish. So management will generally spend time in planning the structure and the implementation of the performance review process, in addition to actually conducting it with the staff members themselves. And staff will also be required to participate in the process by giving feedback. And a comment that you might receive from them is that they also lack the time to complete the performance review and the questions that you're asking them in anticipation of the meeting. But I think when we look at that, I think generally, when we look at the benefit that that performance reviews kind of outweigh as a whole, it's time that you will invest in. You do invest your time in managing team performance. It may also be that the kind of performance reviews sometimes can be really good. They can be really easy conversations to have with staff when their performance over a particular review period has been satisfactory and it's a mere reflection and looking at the future goals for the next year. But they can be really, really difficult conversations. So in order to get value out of a performance review or an online performance review, you do really need to have those difficult conversations where necessary. So where an employee hasn't been performing to the standard that's required within the review period, a performance review is that kind of perfect opportunity, I guess, to discuss in detail the areas that they might not have particularly been performing well in over the review period, and really try and set those action items and a performance plan moving forward. Performance reviews can also be seen as an administrative task. So today we're really here talking about the benefit of online performance reviews. So throughout the presentation today, I guess you really see the benefit that while performance reviews can be seen as a bit of an administrative task, there are systems and processes that you can put in place to reduce the administrative burden that sometimes people often see performance reviews as being. The performance review process isn't only about giving feedback to employees. I say that they're really incredibly beneficial for managers and employees to keep engagement up, because employees are able to feel as though they are being heard in relation to their own employment. So whilst kind of spot feedback might be good, so just giving short little bits of feedback on particular areas throughout a person's employment, it's really good to look at a person's employment and their job description as a whole and how they've progressed it over an extended period of time, rather than picking up those particular issues or good things in relation to performance on a case-by-case basis. A lot of businesses will also associate, and employees more so, will associate a performance review process with a pay rise. But this isn't always the case. So it doesn't necessarily have to be so unless it's been agreed in an employment agreement, or that it states that in a company policy at the time of a performance review, pay will be reviewed. And so whilst doing a performance review, there might not necessarily be a pay rise specifically, there are obviously other benefits that you can give an employee at that period of time to try and boost engagement. We can just move on to the next slide, Annette. So I think in talking about performance reviews, you kind of talked about the negative, but we also need to talk about what can happen if we don't do them. So there's a lot of things that both employers and employees will miss out on if you're not doing formal performance review processes. And the first one, really important, is just engagement. Employees really like to feel that they have a say in relation to their employment. And if you're not meeting with an employee on a scheduled kind of time frame to talk about that, you're really losing that engagement piece there. You might potentially have some flight risks that you don't necessarily know about. An employee might really be keen on leaving, but having a performance review and being able to talk about their performance concerns or things that they feel like they're struggling within their role, you really might be able to turn that around for them and keep the employee employed. It's also not only about talking about what's happened in the past. It really is a discussion about future progression. So where does a particular staff member see their role progressing or their future progressing within the organisation? It can also assist in minimising those potential kind of legal risks. Obviously, performance management is really, really important, particularly if you're wanting to terminate someone's employment for performance management. And if you haven't done a formal performance improvement plan for a specified period, at least you'll have those formal performance reviews that you're doing on a kind of annual or biannual basis. We'll just go over to the next slide, Annette, if that's okay. Thank you. So yeah, look, I think that one of the really key points about doing the performance reviews that isn't necessarily kind of an employer side benefit is just really boosting that employee experience and engagement. So employees will really be more productive if they know what they're required to do within their role and how they're to be going about it. If they can actively participate in setting their own goals and standards and not just having to perform to a particular job description. And if they really believe that through a review period, they will be measured against those specific goals objectively. So there's a real mutual understanding of what they're required to do as part of their role. Whilst I think performance reviews are not necessarily a legal requirement, there's certainly a lot of benefit in conducting the performance reviews because they really help managers and a company be aware of what the expectations are on them to provide employment assistance to their employees, but also what the employees are required to do in return. It's not only simply about a specific employee and their performance individually within their role, but they're a really great opportunity to talk about how an employee is to be engaging and contributing to the organisation goals as a whole, and talking about how an employee thinks that they participate in a particular organisation's values and how they uphold values is also a really important part when we're talking about these performance reviews. So thank you, Annette. I think we'll move on to the next question.
Thank you, Emily. That's awesome. Sascha, I'm going to throw to you now. Record keeping. Why is this an important one? Not only when conducting a performance review, but also when managing employee performance, which Emily just touched on.
Thanks, Annette. Hey, look, I guess the same as what Emily's kind of explained previously as well, is that one of the main purposes of a performance review is to discuss and reflect on the employee's performance throughout the review period. So it's these are often measured against any individual or job KPIs, goals, and objectives. So any goals and objectives agreed upon at the beginning and during a review period, as well as any KPIs and copies of job descriptions, etc., should all be recorded and kept on the employee's file. So it's also good practice to keep record of any training plans or training that has been completed by the employee throughout that period as well. So keeping track of that is really important too. So by keeping those types of records on file, you're able to save all of the information that you need, I guess, in one centralised place for ease of reference. So that'll definitely help when it comes to measuring and monitoring performance, as well as carrying out the actual performance review process when it comes to that point in time as well. So good record keeping will also help to ensure that you have an efficient and consistent and fair process. So records can either be paper-based or electronic. However, as we're going to talk about today as well, doing it electronically or online with a good HR system or software can certainly save you some unnecessary time spent completing forms manually, collating information from lots of different sources, and then also analysing it and filing it. So as Emily pointed out earlier, that the process can be quite time consuming and manual if you don't have a good efficient sort of process in place. Any performance related notes, conversations and communications related to the employee should also be recorded, and these need to be kept in a secure place as well. And they should be recorded at any time that they occur throughout the employee's life cycle. So not just waiting until the performance review process, making sure that you keep those records throughout that review period as well. So it's not only important from a record keeping perspective, but often it's quite difficult to remember what was discussed and when, and if there's any issues that need to be addressed, or of course any good work that needs to be rewarded, it's important that these can be referred to at a later stage and during that performance review process. So record keeping and documenting the process is also especially important if an employee is not performing. So if you end up having to dismiss an employee, or if there is a relationship breakdown, it's important that you have proof that you've given them warnings about that performance, that you've taken steps to try and help them and try and help improve that performance as well. And I guess another key point too is that having evidence on file is also a good idea if you even need to justify any pay increases, or if you're denying them as well, if you have them related to your performance review process. And then finally, you should also ensure that any outcomes or actions from the performance review process are recorded. And that way you've got those agreed action points between yourself and the employee, and they can be actioned and followed up as necessary as well. And I guess another point there too is also giving the employee a copy of that performance review so that they can review and look at that throughout the period, so they can be reminded of what those actions and goals and training that are there as well.
Thanks, Sascha. It's really comprehensive. Emily, I'm going to go over to you again now. So Emily, can you take us through a best practice performance review process and what this will look like?
Absolutely. Look, I think the first thing in terms of with performance reviews, it's really important to try and keep it as simple as possible. So we've kind of got these 5 key steps here on the screen, which I think are really important to keep in mind when you're developing your performance review process. So look, planning is incredibly, incredibly important. The kind of little SMART reference we've got here on the screen refers to specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So it's really important to set those kind of goals and objections from the outset. I think how formal you want to have your process will really depend on the type of workplace that you have. But whatever process you do implement, as Sascha said, it's incredibly important that it's documented, that the process is fair, that it's objective, and that it's kind of consistent across the board with all staff members that are involved. And I think this is one of the really kind of key areas where online performance reviews can definitely be a benefit to the business and help you stay on that kind of best practice process the entire time. So at an employee's first review, when you're having a first performance review with them, it's really important to set those kind of achievable goals and objectives that are really, really relevant to their role. And at each review, you will kind of appraise the things that they've done well, review their employment over the entire review period, and update those goals and objectives for moving forward. So in the performance review itself, it's really important that you request input and feedback from the employee. It's not simply a process where a manager gives feedback on performance and you kind of develop the goals and training modules from there. Often I think it's a really important key part where employees can request particular training where they feel that they might be struggling in some elements of their role. If you've had previous performance reviews, you've got to make sure that the training and development that you set there is on track. A particular performance review isn't an isolated incident. We don't look at one particular performance review and think, okay, that's all done and dusted. Well, we have to keep going through each, biannually or annual performance review process and make sure that you're developing from the kind of meeting that you've had 6 months earlier or 12 months prior, or even conversations that you've had within that period. If for whatever reason you've set goals in one particular review period and they haven't been met, or there's been training that's been required and the same performance reviews are still happening in a follow-ons review period, it's really important to kind of talk about why and really address what we call those barriers barriers to performance and barriers to why a particular employee isn't being able to meet the requirements of their job description. And if there are those barriers, if you have identified them, can you make some adjustments to a particular employee's goals or to their KPIs or to their job description in order for them to better, perform the inherent requirements of the role? And I talked a little bit before about kind of values and behaviours. So it's not only just a process to assess an employee based on their specific kind of KPIs and their contribution to their role as a whole. It really is a time where you can focus on their contribution to the organisation. Now, I will address just in this process, we have had a question from the Q&A that talks about how often you should be doing your performance reviews. And as I've said before, there really is no legal requirement in terms of how often you should be doing them. But I do think that the regularity of performance reviews is something that's really important and should have a lot of consideration. I think most businesses will hold them either annually or biannually, but it really does depend on your workplace and on the number of employees that you have and what really suits the business. I've talked before how there were, a couple of roadblocks to performance reviews being kind of time and the potential administrative burden. But if you've got this kind of process in place and you can conduct biannual performance reviews because you've got a really, really good process, you've got an online performance review system set up, and you've done some really good planning, because planning is really key here, then the kind of time constraints or administrative burden shouldn't necessarily be holding you back for having a biannual performance review. But in saying that as well, it's also really important to understand that a particular performance review process and those scheduled performance reviews doesn't replace the need for regular catch-ups and conversation and feedback to the employees that's both positive and negative, and likewise feedback that employees can give back to management about how they see that they're tracking within their role. And in doing so, goals and performance and training plans can be adjusted during that period between formal performance reviews and not just at your scheduled ones. And again, we've talked about where kind of performance reviews will sit, particularly with the expectation of salary increases. So if you're a company that has in their contract or in a policy that you will be reviewing an employee's remuneration, that will be a really key consideration into how often you will have your performance reviews. All employees will probably want to hear that they're, going to receive a pay increase following a period of performance in a formal performance review. And if for whatever reason that's not happening, that's perfectly fine. But doing that on a regular basis might kind of result in, reduced employee engagement or something like that. So thanks, Annette.
Thank you, Emily. That's really awesome. Sascha, what should be discussed and covered during a performance review process?
Yes, I guess there's a number of things that can be covered during the performance review process. And although there's no kind of set rules as what you should discuss, you just need to ensure that what's being covered is actually adding value to the process. So you need to ensure that it's relevant and that both the employee and the employer both get an opportunity to provide input. So some of the questions that you may want to ask your employees during a performance review process could include things like how well they think they're doing in their job, which parts of their jobs or which elements of their jobs they think they're doing well and where they think they could actually improve. And that's really important to get an employee's perspective on that side of things as well. Whether they need any equipment or training to help them in their role. So making yourself aware of those areas where you can actually help those employees improve. How do they feel about the job and the company? So getting a perspective on the company is just as important as well, because quite often employees will get to see different aspects of a business or company, and it's just good to kind of get their perspective on that as well as overall. What would they change if they could change anything about their job in the company? And what are their longer term aims, and how can you help the employee to achieve those long-term goals? Some other things that you can ask is whether or not they've achieved the goals set from the last appraisal. So you would have had some goals prior in your prior performance review. So you need to review those and see if they've achieved them. And if they haven't, then what needs to change? So what do they need from you as an employer to start achieving those goals, or where do they need to improve to start achieving them? Once again, check in with how satisfied they are with their job. So this is where you can talk about career aspirations or training needs. So do they want more responsibility? Do they need tougher challenges? Would they like a better work-life balance, which is really important for some employees as well? So having that conversation around their satisfaction in their role. Are there any wider issues that are affecting their performance or any positive influences that are helping them? And then whether or not, I guess that conversation that we've talked about, whether or not there's going to be any salary review from that performance review process as well. So making them sure aware of that they're aware of that as well. And it's really just important that, you know, as a good manager, that you don't just tell your employees what's expected of them during that process and then walk away. You really want to make sure that those employees have the tools and the development needed to do their job successfully, and that you give them an opportunity to grow in their job. And then you have regular catch-ups with them as well about their progress in their roles and discuss any barriers to any good performance as well. Thanks, Annette.
Thank you, Sascha. We'll go on to the next question now, and this is the last question actually for you, Emily. How can you as an employer best prepare for performance review process?
Sure, thanks, Annette. Look, I think Sascha and I both said it multiple times, but preparation is key. Preparation is so important when it comes to the performance review process, so that it's really effective and that the time that you spend, you know, in this process is not necessarily not wasted. So it's really important for both and for you as an employer and a manager and the employee to have the entire process prepared from start to finish before it commences. So that kind of thing, the kind of processes that would be involved would be reviewing your job description, reviewing any notes or performance feedback that has been given throughout the performance period. And prior to meeting with your employee to discuss this in person, seek feedback from them. So you'd be asking them specific questions about how they feel that they've performed over the review period. How do they see their performance or their role progressing over the next 6, 12 months, or even up to the kind of 5-year mark? Asking what their view is in terms of whether there have been any roadblocks to their performance, and so that you can go into that performance review knowing where kind of the business stands in relation to a particular employee's performance and where the employee stands, so that you can really facilitate a really valuable discussion in that, you know, 30 minutes to an hour that you will have with them to reset those goals. So it really is, in terms of, I've talked about before, it's this ongoing process. We don't look at performance reviews being an isolated incident, but prior to going into the performance review, if you're going to do anything, it's just really important to reflect on the year gone or the previous performance reviews that you've had, and make sure that you've got a lot of information about how a particular employee is tracking in relation to those goals. It might also be important to get feedback from other people. So you will obviously have a view on how a particular staff member is performing, and they will as well. But are there other kind of stakeholders that you can engage to seek feedback on a particular individual's performance, so that you can discuss that with them and get further feedback outside just the kind of manager and employee relationship? So in terms of an online performance review, the way that this is normally structured is you'd be sending them their kind of questions in relation to their performance and seeking their feedback. But you might also, as Sascha's talked about, you know, the kind of evidentiary requirements and how you're going to store the information in relation to the performance reviews, gathering those together, and if there's been conversations with other managers as well, getting those so that you're fully equipped to discuss those within the meeting. And if we'll just go on to the next slide, Annette, we've got kind of these really kind of simple steps into doing the performance review. And look, if you're a current client or a prospective client, this is the type of process in a step-by-step basis that we have developed for a really effective online performance review process. So we use kind of KRAs, which are key result areas which an employee will have, and often these are taken from an employee's job description, but also it might be from organisational goals, or if you've got particular goals within a team, you might include them there as well. They might also have particular rating scales, so you might be giving an employee about a score between 1 and 5 or 1 and 10 about whether they aren't meeting expectations, whether they meet expectations, if they are kind of exceeding, or if they're doing things really well. So you'd assign those to a particular individual and then initiate the performance review process online, where they would be able to get their feedback on the particular KRAs. Following that, once you've got all the information there, you then conduct the meeting. So face-to-face is a really great way to do your performance reviews. But obviously, at the moment, I'm sure a number of kind of organisations have been conducting their performance reviews online. But we do see that it's really important that whilst you can kind of give an employee can give written feedback and a manager can give written feedback, being able to talk to them in a face-to-face forum, whether that's in person or whether that's kind of over Zoom or Teams, is really important to talk further and not just reflect on what a person's written in response to the questions that they've been asked. It's also important generally because then you can come to the kind of common understanding about what the goals will be moving forward, and that might not necessarily come through in just the simple online aspect of providing feedback from both ends. And another thing that you can do is you can run reports or check up on performance progress. So if you're doing kind of annual performance reviews, you might have quick check-ins every 1 to 2 months or quarterly to make sure that you are making sure that you're actually achieving the task that you've wanted to, and not getting to your next performance review in 6 or 12 months' time having not achieved the kind of goals that you've set in that particular review meeting.
Thanks, Emily. I think you've summed that up quite well. Sascha, thank you also for your input as well. So before we go to the audience for some questions, I just want to point out how our software can easily streamline the performance review process for your business, saving time and money, accessing reporting, creating consistent processes that are no longer manual, and easy record keeping are just some of the benefits. We know that performance reviews can be onerous, even when you're following these best practice steps that Sascha and Emily have showed us today. But what if I could tell you that there was a less time-consuming and more engaging way to create feedback and conversations that count? When you use our software, in just the hit of a button, you can distribute and organise all of your employees' performance reviews. So thank you again, Sascha and Emily. Now let's go to the audience for some questions. There are a couple of questions coming through, so just give me a moment. I'm just going to read them. Okay, so Jenny is wondering, how do you ensure that performance reviews are optimistic in nature and support the positive culture within the organisation? Sascha, did you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's a few ways that you can do that, and it is a balance between kind of balancing that negative feedback, if there's negative feedback, but also positive as well, and focusing on those positive achievements that the employee has had through that review period. So you want to talk about how the company can support them in their role, and it's once again listening to perhaps where they think they need more support and help. So putting a positive aspect on that is coming in with ways that you can help that employee achieve those goals, and where they necessarily may need further support and help. And it's also a good opportunity to talk about the company in general as well. So discuss the company values, how the employee might be applying those values, and also any direction that the business might be going in. So any exciting kind of changes or things that are coming up for the business as well. So that's sort of, I guess, building the excitement with the employee about working for your business as well, is also another way to do it. And yeah, just as I say, it is a balance between that positive and negative feedback, but it's also important to kind of get an understanding of how an employee receives feedback, and kind of basing your discussions and conversations around how that employer may take on that feedback as well, because some people do take feedback in different ways. So just kind of adjusting to your audience is important too. So Emily, do you have anything to add to that at all? Or
No, I think you answered that incredibly well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sascha. We have another question here about the difference between, say, that one-on-one meeting and a performance review, and are they necessary?
Sure, I'll take that one. And I do think they are necessary. I think it's really important to distinguish between, a quick one-on-one meeting that's assessing particular elements of performance in the short term, and then the performance review that will look at the overall performance to, every KPI and every element of a job description, and also the way that an employee is contributing to the organisation as a whole. So when you have a one-on-one meeting in relation to performance that is a potential one-off, it might just be because an employee isn't doing a particular element of their role or isn't meeting a particular KPI, and you'll be talking about the things that the business can do to assist that employee in achieving those targets. But performance reviews aren't just about performance and aren't just about meeting KPIs. There's so much more to that, which I think we've touched on today. It's really talking about, the future and setting those goals for an employee's employment as a whole, and really kind of trying to promote employee engagement and employee feedback, which I think that one-on-one meeting in relation to a particular performance that's generally, not all the time, that can generally be a little bit more negative because it means an employee is needing more assistance in the short term. So it was really important to distinguish between those key elements.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, I've got another question about remote workforces and hybrid workforces. How can performance reviews support those people that are working not at the location based and they're not face to face? Sascha, did you want to chime in on this one?
Yes, I think Emily might have touched on that a bit earlier as well, but that is a common thing, I guess, at the moment with our world, not being able to do those face-to-face conversations. So, the video calling kind of tools and things for those performance review processes are probably really good. So you'll do your online performance review process, get the feedback, have your input, things like that. But I think at the end, when you come to meet with the employee to discuss the outcomes and the goals and the achievements, that face-to-face is still really important. So if you can do that online via a Zoom call or something like that, then I think that's just as important. But the regular catch-ups too, so the opportunities, I think you can't beat just a face-to-face conversation, even if it is via video, but you can still read each other a lot better like that, and have better conversations, I think, instead of over email, which can often be misinterpreted, or through an online system. So yeah, still try and get the ability to have those face-to-face meetings as much as possible, even if it is virtual.
Thank you, Sascha. Okay, this is one about constructive criticism during, I guess, that performance review process, and what is the best approach to giving that kind of feedback to an employee. Emily, I might get you to answer that one if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think sometimes when we look at giving what we would call, an employee feedback, that means that they haven't performed a particular element in their role, we do kind of call it that type of constructive criticism. And I think the best approach is if you, and this is, I think, why it's really important when we talk about planning for performance reviews, when we give an employee feedback and we seek their own feedback as well. It very well might be that on a particular area an employee is really self-aware about how they've been tracking, and the feedback doesn't necessarily come as a surprise. But I think the most important part in the way that you should approach giving an employee feedback that isn't necessarily positive, is talking about not only that there is responsibility on a particular individual to turn around their performance and to change and improve, but also how the business and how management is going to assist them in doing it. An employee performance is not a one-sided thing. I think a particular employee's performance is also really kind of is reflective of how their manager is managing their performance, managing feedback, and providing them assistance in order to meet the inherent requirements of their role. So I think if you are needing to give criticism or feedback that isn't necessarily positive to an employee in a performance management process, it's not taking responsibility might not necessarily be the right phrase, but talk to an employee about what they're going to do, but also what the organisation or managers are going to do in order to help them achieve those goals, because it will mean that they're feeling really supported in that, and that they're not, having to work through something that they've been finding difficult on their own.
Wonderful. I think you answered that quite well, Emily. I think we've only got a few more. Okay, this is a good one. Is there anything we should avoid or not say in a performance review to an employee? I guess, what should you not say? Sascha, do you want to have a go at answering this one?
Could be a few things in this scenario, what not to say. But I guess just some important points is around, not making it personal so much, and focusing on the job and their performance in that role, but not making the feedback personal in any way, so offending the employee or anything like that, and not purely focusing on the negatives, which we've talked about as well. So having, hopefully there's some positives in those conversations as well. Try not to blame the employee for things that are perhaps out of their control. So I guess you don't want the employee to take on a burden that they can't necessarily control outside of what they're doing in their role. So making sure that things that are happening within the business are not necessarily blamed on that employee, and try not to compare them to other people as well. Sometimes that can happen. It's quite easy to say, well, you're not performing as well as Jenny in this role because of such and such. I think it's important that you just focus on the individual without making those comparisons. So trying not to do that in the performance review. And even maybe, the threatening of jobs or anything like that probably shouldn't be discussed in there as well. So, there's a proper process that should be followed if there needs to be performance management issues and things like that. So threatening an employee's role at that time with their performance review is not a good thing. And there shouldn't, I guess we've talked about this as well, but there shouldn't be really any surprises in those performance review conversations as well, because you're reflecting on the period, you're getting the input from the employee. So yeah, just I guess bringing up last minute things and talking about the potential of an employee losing their job or anything like that shouldn't necessarily be discussed at that time.
Great. Okay, excellent tips to avoid. We actually had a last minute question come through, and I do want to bring this to Emily's attention. Should you offer the employee to bring a support person to a performance review meeting if the review is not positive?
Look, no, you don't have to. This consideration around a support person comes from in Australia. Generally, it's around the kind of the unfair dismissal jurisdiction and legislation where you can't you can't unreasonably refuse an employee a support person. But generally that's where you're having a meeting with an employee that will be potentially related to termination of their employment. But we've also got to consider that some employees can find the performance review process really stressful. So some people might be absolutely fine, really happy to talk with their manager about the performance, but others might need the kind of support of having someone else there. So from a procedural fairness element, there's no need to offer it. And because we're not talking about a performance review being a performance management and disciplinary process, there's no real requirement, and typically it's not something that would be offered. But if an employee is requesting it, they're a bit stressed or overwhelmed about the concept of a performance review, or they've potentially raised that they've been struggling mentally and they've been struggling with their mental health in relation to their performance. I don't see it being an unreasonable request from a staff member and for an employer being able to have an employee attend there in the performance review meeting. And again, that can be someone that's external, or they might want to bring along a colleague to talk about their performance within the meeting.
Great, thanks, Emily. There is one more question, and I think I might be able to answer this one. Is the software offered cloud-based only? So yes, Enable HR is a cloud-based software, and HR Assured's HRA Cloud is also a cloud-based only software. So if you do want to find out more information about what we do, please get in touch with us. Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions today. But before we go, I wanted to offer anyone who is not already a HR Assured or Enable HR client the opportunity to see a demo of our system and discuss your own internal processes. Someone in our team will be in touch with you after the webinar to arrange this. And please look out for our email. We will be sharing the recording from today, as well as a performance review checklist and access to our free consultation. And we do hope that you found the information presented useful and practical, and we'd like to see you at our next webinar, so please look out for those. Emily and Sascha, thank you very much for your time today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.